Commander is a format that we all love and enjoy, but it's a little difficult to enjoy the format whenever you're always behind your opponents at the table. So let's talk about a few tips and tricks to advance your game plan so that way you can enjoy the format maybe a little bit more. What is up, Commander players? My name is Matt and you're watching Top Commanders. So, in my last video I talked about one card turnarounds that can help catch you back up in a game that you've fallen behind in. But today's video is going to be a slightly different approach. We're going to talk about different tips and tricks that you can utilize to help you stay in the game or keep up with everybody else at the table. But before I get into that, if you wish to support this channel, be sure to like, share, and subscribe. And if you want to support this channel directly, be sure to visit patreon.com/topcommander. But with that out of the way, let's go ahead and get right into it. So, one of the biggest issues that I've seen is the way that a lot of this roots to the way that you build your deck, in all honesty. And these are just very simple, very easy tips to just kind of follow and help improve your game plan so that way you can enjoy the game a little bit more. So, first piece of advice, early ramp. What do I mean by early ramp? Any cheap ramp is way better than using like Explosive Vegetation, Sky Shroud Claim, Solemn Simulacrum, Warm Power Stones. There's a lot of ramp pieces that are not necessarily that great. Anything that costs more than 2 mana to ramp you, you might want to take a second look at. Now, I'm not saying that these cards are bad. I'm just saying that they don't need to be in every single deck. I'm saying look at what your deck is doing. How much mana does your deck need to operate? Sometimes you only need the cheap mana rocks or, you know, even Farseek, Rampant Growth. Those are fine. These all cost 2 mana or less. Using Lotus Petals or whatever, you know, depending on your budget, of course. But don't be afraid to use Signets, Talismans, Thought Vessels, Felwar Stones. Like, you don't, even in a green deck, these are options that are honestly better for you than using the big, expensive stuff like Solemn and Sky Shroud Claim. Because you don't want to be ramping on turn 4. You don't want to land pass, and then finally get to play a ramp piece and only ramp by a little bit. It's a lot easier if the majority of your ramp spells are 2 mana or less. Now, I know a lot of people don't like Mana Crypt. There are playgroups that don't accept that, but there's plenty of mana rocks that cost 2 or less. There's plenty of mana elves out there that cost 1 and can help ramp you. In the early game, you're worried about setup. Your ramp is your setup. Adjust where you can do setup early and ramp quicker. Being able to ramp quicker gets you out into the board a little bit easier so you have the mana available to keep playing things to keep you in a game. You know, you don't want to be casting a 6 mana spell on turn 6. You want to cast that 6 mana spell on turn 4. And it's possible without doing the really expensive fast mana rocks. So, like I said, Talismans, Signets, Soul Ring comes in every precon. So, Soul Ring into a Signet on turn 1, you have 4 mana available on turn 1. 5 on turn 2. Because of that gameplay. Right there. There's no reason not to run early ramp. You want to run the early ramp. The reason why I brought up Warm Power Stone is because it's 3 mana and it enters tapped. Gives you 2, yes, but it's essentially, you might as well just be playing Sisay's Ring, which is the 4 mana rock that gives you 2. Or Hedron Archive. Hedron Archive would honestly be better because of the fact that you can sack it to draw 2 cards later. You have that utility. There's nothing wrong with that one, but you want the majority of your ramp to be early ramp, is basically the point. Now, next piece of advice, number 2, using cantrips. Alright. If you're in a if you're in a color that has cantrips available. Now, what do I mean by cantrips? I'm talking about one card that gives you one card. So, cards like Brainstorm, Preordain, anything like that. In red, anything like your technically it's a cantrip, but like your Faithless Looting, your Tormenting Voice, anything like that that's not actually getting you a bunch of cards. Because if you look at the case of like Tormenting Voice, I consider it more of a cantrip because you're using a card out of your hand, you have to discard another card out of your hand to then draw 2 cards. That's not getting you card advantage. It's getting you through the deck, yes, but it's not drawing cards, if that makes sense. You want to be able to use these cantrips early as well, so that way you can find your early ramp or your card draw effects if you run Rhystic Study. You want to get that onto the board as quickly as possible so you can start drawing cards. Mystic Remora, anything like this. Any kind of card advantage engine that you have in your deck, you want to use your cantrips to try to get those. Or get your ramp. Make sure you have your land drops. Those are what cantrips are typically used for, and that's what they should be used for to begin with. I've seen so many people actually use cantrips just to get a creature, and it's like, why not worry about the card draw? And your card draw will get you plenty of creatures and answers and land drops and ramp and everything else. Be smart about how you use your cantrips. Cantrips are there for a reason, and they're very useful for very specific reasons. Alright, number 3. Pay attention to your mana curve. And this is not a CEDH thing either, because CEDH already knows these things. These are things that CEDH utilizes. But just because you use some of these tactics does not make you a CEDH player. We're talking about ways to help you just enjoy the game. If you have a commander deck and you have 15 cards in it that cost 6 mana or more, you're probably going to have a hard time in that game. Unless you have a ton of ramp in there. We're talking like you have to have about 14, 15 pieces of ramp. Your average commander deck only needs about 10 or 12. I typically stick with about 12 pieces of ramp just to make sure that I'm hitting my ramp. This is a big thing because the lower the mana curve, the more spells that you can play. And when you're looking at a lower mana curve, granted, you need to pay attention to what cards you're grabbing, what cards you're playing. But if your deck is full of giant haymakers and your deck is not built to actually take advantage of that and actually utilize those, if you can't play more than one of those a turn, you might want to take another look at your deck and lower that mana curve. Take a couple of the big things out. Don't run, the giant insurrections and expropriate and all the Eldrazi Titans and a Blightsteel Colossus. If you don't have them, if your deck's not built to be able to do all of that, it's not a good idea to run all of that. Just figure out what you want to do with the deck. Take the big things out. You don't have to take all of them out. If you have like 3 cards in your deck that are over 6 mana, that's fine. As long as you can ramp to them and utilize them. If you're using, for instance, if you're using Eldrazi Titans or a Blightsteel Colossus. Now, if you're not necessarily going to play them all the time, and they're mainly in there just so you can pitch them and recycle your graveyard, that's okay. As long as your deck is able to do that consistently and you can use that to your advantage. However, if you're trying to build your deck to ramp into this giant, big battle cruiser thing, then you need to look at how you're doing it. So, pay attention to your mana curve, and that can go a long way. Because the more spells you can play, the more board presence you will have, and the more likely you are to stick around in that game. Number 4, do your research. Now, what do I mean by do your research? When you sit down at a table and everybody reveals their commanders, you need to have some idea of what that commander is going to do. What could that player possibly be doing with that commander? Now, are you going to be 100% right? Not all the time. But just knowing what the commander is, what it's doing, can give you an idea of what they have in the deck. Also, if you're playing with your regular play group, obviously when you play with them long enough, you kind of know what to expect from their deck, and you need to pay attention to that because that can go a long way with helping you win games later on down the road. So, doing your research just kind of gives you an idea of what the commander is and what your opponent might be doing. That goes a long way with being able to improve your gameplay a little bit. Which also leads into threat assessment. Try to have really good threat assessment. I'm guilty of not having the best threat assessment, but having a decent enough threat assessment, kind of when you're doing your research on somebody, if you're paying attention and seeing what kind of cards they're playing, you know what to expect. You know what the threat is. You know what cards they might be playing that will trip you up or stop you or anything like that. Keep an eye out for that stuff. That's your threat assessment. Being able to stop cards that will stop you. Or stop cards that will have them win, which technically still stops you, because if they win, you lose. So being able to stop them helps you. Number 6, politics. Generate value through words. This goes so well. I've sat down at tables where nobody says a word. There is no politics. There are no deals being made. People refuse to do politics. And those games could have went so much more different if there was more deals made. Especially if you think about it, if you're having good threat assessment is one thing, but what if your opponent plays a threat but you don't have an answer for it yet? Maybe you haven't drawn your answer. Maybe you haven't had a tutor to go get your answer. That can present a problem, right? So using politics, because if it's bad for you, chances are that it might be bad for somebody else at the table as well. So especially if you don't have the answer, you want to open that line of politics and be like, hey, does anybody have anything to stop this? Now, for instance, let's say that you had a Dovin's Veto, right? So Dovin's Veto is a blue-white counterspell that says counter target non-creature spell, and it cannot be countered. Now, that's a really good card. If you're in blue and white, you should be running that. That's a really good counterspell. But let's say your opponent is about to play some kind of creature with a stacks effect that affects the whole board. Maybe they play, I can't remember her name. It was a white angel that your opponents can't use activated abilities. So if they play that, and it's going to shut you down, but you have a Dovin's Veto, it only counters non-creature. and that's the only answer you have in your hand. Somebody else at the table, it's about to hurt them as well. Okay, she hits the field. You're both kind of in trouble at that point, but if you're like, hey, I don't have anything to stop that, can you stop that? Sure. Swords to plowshares, path to exile, whatever. Maybe they have the answer. They could get rid of it. But then your opponent counterspells them. You can use that Dovin's veto in politics. You just open up a line and be like, if you can get rid of her, I can help you make sure that this is gotten rid of. That's a line of politics. So they play the threat, and it's a creature, and they go to remove it, somebody counters it, you have a Dovin's veto, and you can counter that, and nobody can counter your thing. This is what I mean. Just simple lines of politics. You don't necessarily have to go to the extent of, if you don't touch my board for one turn, I won't blow up your big thing. Now, granted, yes, you can do those lines of politics. Those can be a thing. But not every game you're going to be in is going to have that level of politics. So just be careful about that. But in the end, politics can happen in any Commander game. It just depends on what extent of politics you can go to. Next up, Mulligans. This is probably the biggest culprit of people not having fun game experiences. When you're falling very, very far behind, mulligans are a huge thing that can help. When you are getting set up, you are allowed a free mulligan. I typically always take that free mulligan, unless my first hand is just absolutely magnificent. You're looking to make sure that you have enough lands. Maybe 2 or 3 lands, a couple of pieces of ramp, maybe a card draw engine, something like that, or at least cantrips to get into that stuff. You want to be able to make sure that you can do this. If you don't have those, and you keep a hand with a 6-drop, and you don't have any way in your hand to get that out on turn 2 or 3, mulligan. Just mulligan. No questions asked. Don't keep a hand with a Blightsteel Colossus. I run a Blightsteel in my artifact deck. I don't even do this, okay? Unless it's the only high CMC card in my hand, and the rest of my hand I can play with. It's just like if I mulligan down to 6. But very, very rarely do I keep a hand if I see a Blightsteel, because I try to make sure that the entire hand can be played between turns, 3 or 4. Between, as long as I have the early ramp, by turn 2, turn 3, I'm playing stuff. You want to be able to make sure that you're playing cards. So knowing how to mulligan, knowing what hands to keep, this goes a long way with improving your gameplay experience. If you keep a bad hand, you're probably going to have a bad game. Just remember that. And the last one that I've got for today is actually a pretty simple one. Don't overextend. A lot of people don't have contingencies in their deck to be able to pull this off. If you overextend your board and somebody board wipes you, you need to make sure that you can come back from that. If you can't, you're in trouble. That is the biggest point on this. Don't overextend yourself. Keep some stuff back. You don't necessarily have to dump out your hand, because when the board wipe hits, then it's over. You're behind, and then you're hoping to top deck a 1-card turnaround. And the odds of that happening are very, very slim. And you're not going to enjoy that game the rest of the game. Like, the rest of that time, you're not going to enjoy it. So don't overextend. Be careful about overextending. Now, you can overextend into a board and have a massive board presence if you have the card draw going on and your hand is still full. That's okay, because when they board wipe, you have cards in your hand to be able to redeploy. That's okay, if you have that going. If you don't, be careful, because one board wipe will send you to the Stone Age, essentially. But And these are just simple tips. This is just the easy stuff to kind of improve things. Early ramp, make sure you're using your cantrips properly, watch your mana curve, do some research, be mindful of what your opponents are playing, have proper threat assessment, mulligan properly. These are just easy tips, but you'd be surprised at how many people out there actually don't do these things. I know that I was guilty of it for the longest time, and I just started doing a lot of these tips myself, and it's helped out my gameplay a lot more. There are other tips that you could go with as well to improve your gameplay. I'll probably do another video based on this later on down the road. But let me know down in the comments below what you guys think. Is there anything that I missed? Have you had to go through any of these changes yourself? Have they worked for you? Do you find this video informative? Let me know down in the comments below, and I'll see you guys next video.